I'm Celeste, and this is Celestial Navigation. This is the next part of an ongoing series reviewing Dr. Preston Sprinkle's interview with Dr. Paul Eddy about detransition, and I'm happy to have my friend Billie Hoard join me again. With that, we begin with Dr. Preston Sprinkle.
This is a tangent a bit, but I mean, you kind of brought it up. What is that? Is it each state has its own law on how old a person needs to be where they don't need parental consent? I heard, and see if this is true, in Oregon, I think it's as young as like 15. As long as you're 15 years old, you don't need any parental guidance to sign off on a medical procedure. Or does that vary state this? And please, if people are listening and you're interested in that, go fact check me. I could be off on that. I remember.
Hey, future Celeste here. I looked up the Oregon policy and wanted to read it because, while Dr. Sprinkle is not wrong, what he is saying is very misleading. This is from the FAQ on the guidelines for gender dysphoria in the state of Oregon, and is the source for Dr. Sprinkle's similar claim in his book on transgender people, Embodied. There, he claimed, there's an ongoing push to lower the age where kids can get hormones and surgery without their parents' consent. Currently, in Oregon, 15-year-olds can medically transition without the consent of their parents. Here's what the Oregon law says. Can minors receive services for gender dysphoria, and why? Do they need parental consent? Age of medical consent varies by state. Oregon law, which applies to Medicaid and non-Medicaid Oregonians, states that the age of medical consent is 15. Physicians are not required to provide any medical service to a minor, and in most cases will encourage, and in some cases require, family engagement and support unless it would endanger the patient. In addition, guidelines contain numerous safeguards to ensure that candidates are appropriate for surgery, and medically it is safer and easier to conduct surgery earlier before secondary sex characteristics are fully developed. That's all to say, yes, a minor can consent, but that is the rule for all medical care in Oregon. No special carve-out is being made here, either raising or lowering the age at which Oregonians can consent. Furthermore, it makes clear that family engagement is still encouraged and that no physician is required to provide these services. Rightly, it makes note of exceptions to family engagement where it would, quote, endanger the patient, as is the case for some transgender teens growing up with unapproving parents. Sprinkle's out-of-context reference to this policy makes it sound like something remarkable is happening, when in fact, gender-affirming care simply was administered under existing law. Okay, back to Dr. Eddy's answer.
We're reading that somewhere a couple years ago. Is that something each state just decides that? And is that as young as like 15, 16, 17? Or do you already know?
You know, that is a great question. And honestly, Preston, I think now that you raised that question, I realized so much. The bulk of my research really focused on the scientific side of things. I never got into a lot of the legislative side of this. So I don't.
Just remember that he said that. I never got into the legislative side of this. Remember that as we go forward.
I don't know the answer to that question, but it's a very important question.
Yeah.
And obviously, in the last couple of years, a much debated question in many state legislatures around transgender care for children and adolescents. So a major issue.
And by much debated, we mean that Heritage Foundation, Alliance Defending Freedom, Family Research Council, et cetera, have been pushing bills into Republican state houses across the country. That's not a bunch of legislatures just were like, oh my gosh, we have concern. We need to talk about this or things like that. It's not what's there.
Yeah, we have a whole thing where people will take an issue and then they will start contesting it when it wasn't contested before they came in with their interest.
Right.
And then after they've been contesting for a while, they'll start pointing to the fact of it's being a contested issue to argue for like greater caution around it. And you're going, yeah, but it's only contested because you're contesting it. Like, and I think that's the wave that, and I'm not saying that Sprinkle and Eddy are like pushing that wave. I think they kind of try to stay off, like kind of in the background when it comes to gender affirming, laws regarding care. But they're very much riding the wave of like, it's people who agree with you that have made this contested. It actually wasn't for a while. Like it had become contested.
Absolutely.
Who is the major world-renowned psychologist who specializes in gender dysphoria who got fired from his Toronto clinic because he was advocating for a year of psychoanalysis before people transition? Who was his name? Zucker.
And Zucker, ironically, is the editor, has been for a couple of decades, I think, of the journal called the Archives of Sexual Behavior, which arguably is the leading journal in social science in the world.
Yeah.
And yet got fired from his position at Toronto. He was there for decades because of this very issue. This is how political it's really become.
But he wasn't opposed. I mean, he just said people should go through a rigorous psychoanalysis before, right? And then they accuse him of advocating for like reparative therapy or something.
Well, here's the thing: Zucker and his team, for many years, through the 80s, 90s, into the 2000s, they were one of the leading clinics, certainly one of the North American clinics for childhood gender dysphoria. And their approach really was, let's see if we can do psychological interventions that lead to desistance of gender dysphoria. And so they weren't taking, they certainly weren't affirmative. They weren't even taking what kind of the third major model, the watch and see model, watch and wait. They were actively attempting to do psychological interventions. And that got tagged then by affirmative folks as conversion therapy. Wow. And that's why he got,
because it's conversion therapy.
By that whole side.
Has there been some reevaluation now? So there's been a very gender affirmative only standard of care in the United States and I believe Canada, right? Where kind of what you said earlier, like is on.
Okay, since the mid-1970s, Zucker has treated about 500 pre-adolescent gender variant children to have them conform to the gender identity they were assigned at birth until they are at an age he believes they may determine their own gender identity. He's advocating conversion therapy.
Yeah, he's been pushing conversion therapy for a very long time and he eventually got caught doing it. And that's why he's discredited. It's pretty straightforward. He is going against the consensus in his field in ways that are deemed harmful to children and to the other people that he treats.
It wasn't even just like, oh, he was a researcher or somebody who asked the question, should we be doing conversion therapy? It was, he was doing conversion therapy against medical best practices, which is called medical malpractice, right?
Yeah.
Doctors get fired for that. Like if you have a doctor and they're just like, well, I know the medical says, I'm supposed to treat your broken leg with this and this and this, but I'm going to do it by giving you an antibiotic, right? Like,
right.
It's like that doctor is going to be hauled before some sort of board and have to answer for that. Like, you can't just make up your own standards of care. Like, that's not how we safeguard medicine. Hey there. If you're enjoying this episode, can you make sure to like the video and subscribe to the channel? And feel free to leave a comment with feedback, your own observations, or a question. Okay, let's get back to it.
As long as the person has informed consent, then they're the ones who can decide whether they want this, hormones or surgery or not. Have you been following this stuff like in the Scandinavian countries and the UK and even where there's been some kind of like pulling on that, saying maybe we do need to go back to emphasizing more psychotherapy before we have, invasive surgeries and so on? Is that?
Yes. And you're absolutely right. I mean,
This is where he just said, I don't keep up on the legislative side, and now he's going to talk about how these countries are doing things.
Interesting here is Europe really was the initial kind of location for embracing a more affirmative position. Right? I mean, believe it or not, 1931, Switzerland made it legal. I think it was Switzerland, either Switzerland or Sweden, made it legal to change your sex. 1931. And I think that was Switzerland, and then Sweden made it legal in 1972. So a lot of this kind of Europe led the way on this. U.S. was sort of slow on the uptake on this. Now, particularly over the last, I'd say, 4 years, and I think a lot of this goes back to a particular lawsuit that got filed in the UK, known as the Bell v. Tavistock suit. It was a young woman, Keira Bell, who had undergone transition surgery, hormonal and mastectomy at the UK's major gender center, it's called the Tavistock. I think at age 17, and by early 20s, she had detransitioned and brought a suit against them. A lot of the European nations, and we're talking here, Sweden, Finland, I think Norway, and now the UK itself, have all pulled back when they've seen a rising number of younger detransitioning, particularly natal females who transitioned to male, rethinking that within a few years. Most of the detransitions happening, not surprisingly, because so many are now female to male transitionings, that number just exploded. A lot of the detransitioners are people who began a transition towards male and are wanting to go back to female. And often it happens in adolescent years transitioning, and by mid to late 20s, detransitioning. And that...
His lack of citing a source on this when he's previously been saying, I can't get numbers over 3%, right, really should be challenging to anybody who's paying attention right now, because he's saying a lot of them are doing this. He has no study to back that up. He has no data to back that up. He's just saying it. Again, this is doctors Sprinkle and Eddy pulling shit out of their ass. I mean, I'm sorry, but like they're just saying, and like they're just repeating a narrative that we know was pushed in, for instance, on the BBC by TERFs, right? Like by people who were explicitly anti-trans. Like the degree to which he has not showing any evidence of doing his due diligence in understanding what's going on in England and what has been going on in the UK and the ways in which the American religious right has been funding anti-trans groups in the UK in order to like workshop anti-trans ideas and strategies, which is an explicit example of all of this bias creation that he is Magic Jesus protected against.
Right.
Is just alarming. Like this man should not be saying this stuff if he is here presenting himself as a careful researcher. Like that's obvious and well-known, well-documented background stuff. Then for him not to be talking about it and just repeating this narrative again without citing any data, just repeating a narrative is malpractice.
Yeah, and I did look it up. Bell v. Tavistock. Bell lost that case. The ultimate answer on that was like she lost. Anybody can bring a lawsuit for any number of things, but hers was unsuccessful. Like the fact that she brought it, it's unknown whether or not that, like what effect that had. The fact that he's citing it still today, that's just strange to cite a case where somebody brought a suit and lost.
Yeah.
That's odd. I did do a deep dive on all of those countries that get named normally on the ways that they are quote unquote pulling back. Essentially, they're not. The UK in the last like couple months here has put in actual restrictions on puberty blockers for minors, other restrictions on HRT. It's terrible. It's awful that they're doing that. All of the other countries, none of them have actually made anything gender affirming care wise illegal. None of them have actually banned it. Some of them have put in, if you're going to do this, you have to have it be, under these circumstances, but they're pretty reasonable from what I looked at.
The governmental agencies in Europe, for some reason, it seems that North America is kind of doubling down on the affirmative path.
Oh, is it? Okay.
In face of.
There have been over 1,000 anti-trans bills in the last 19 months in America. 20 states have some form of gender affirming care ban on minors at this point in the US, right? Versus the UK just did it for minors. I don't understand what he's saying. North America is doubling down while Europe is pulling back.
My only guess is that he is, again, I'm trying to do that like most gracious reading of him as I can, right? And it's still not good, is that he is not talking about legislation. He is talking about something like a medical consensus. And even there, it's not true. So what I think he's done is he's created this kind of illusion, like he's sort of referenced without citing anything that like these European countries are pulling back. And then then if he had to try to justify America is not pulling back, he obviously can't cite legislation. I guess maybe he would try to cite like national as opposed to state legislation, but that's just a simple misunderstanding of the federal system that we have.
Right.
So all he has to cite is like American physicians are still convinced that gender affirmation is the way to go. And American psychologists and psychiatrists.
Right.
They are.
That part very much is true. Every major medical organization in America still strongly supports gender affirmation.
As they should.
Right.
This. Yeah.
So it's not slowly following the lead of these European countries.
Not amongst what I would consider to be the really influential researchers in our country. And I think, again, part of this is it's got caught up into the politics of it all, that conservative lawmakers in certain states are pushing against it. And so we don't want to be them. And it's a real.
Like conservative politicians in England aren't pushing against it. My gosh.
So scientists said gender affirming care is good. So policies updated to allow gender affirming care be covered and things like that. Following the science and the medical recommendations, conservatives, particularly motivated by religion, I'll link the Translash podcast in the description as well. Conservatives pushed back, and now Dr. Eddy is saying liberals are defending it because conservatives are against it, or even scientists are defending it because conservatives are against it.
Is what he is saying.
Not the chain of causality here. That's it for this episode. We've still got a lot to cover, so come back next time. You'll find Billie's socials and my own, as well as related resources in the show notes. Thank you for listening.